From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Russia's road from perestroika and glasnost to Yeltsin and Putin's corruption, terror, and dictatorship. We go inside the criminal state of Russia with the first American journalist to be expelled from Russia since the Cold War. That's today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. David Satter has written about Russia for almost 4 decades now. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a fellow of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, known as ZEISS. His new book, The Less You Know, The Better You Sleep, Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship under Yeltsin and Putin. Welcome you from Paris this morning, David. How are you?
Oh, fine. Glad to be with you.
It's a good afternoon over there. Just a first...
It's afternoon here, definitely.
Yeah. Just a quick question first. In response to these sanctions that were just voted by Congress, Putin's already apparently had some of our property seized, and we're going to have diplomats chucked out of there. Any comment on that?
Well, it's an appropriate measure, and Putin's reaction is, he can do it. He can take whatever steps he likes, but the fact is that the aggression against a sovereign state, the seizure of territory, has to be answered, and the Russians have to understand that they'll pay a price for that. So they continue to be waging war in Ukraine. They have not released, or they've not returned Crimea, to Ukraine. So I think that further sanctions are in order.
All right, talking about having diplomats thrown out, how did you get yourself thrown out of Russia?
Well, I can say that I didn't do much. I had been in Moscow only for 3 months on assignment as an accredited correspondent, but also an advisor to the Russian service of Radio Liberty. And during those 3 months, I had time to open a bank account, to go through a lot of bureaucracy, to do some shopping. I did a few articles, but for the most part, they concerned historical events. So I think it was in anticipation of what I would do. And the Russian authorities had been tolerating me for an awfully long time. I had written about the 1999 apartment bombings, which brought Putin to power, and that's the most important question in Russia's post-Soviet history. I mean, the fact that most Americans are unaware of it doesn't make it less important. It just shows the extent to which we have not fulfilled our kind of intellectual responsibilities. But the situation changed in the world. There was a revolt in neighboring Ukraine in which the people of Ukraine united, in effect, to throw out a kleptocratic ruler. The Russian authorities saw that as a very undesirable precedent, and the previous liberal attitude that they had applied to foreign correspondence seemed to be a luxury they could no longer afford, and the first person that they wanted out of there was me.
We've spoken with Bill Browder before. We're speaking with him again, and he's definitely felt that he's at risk and has had to do measures to protect himself. Did you ever feel at safety risk?
Well, in Russia, no, but that may well have been a miscalculation on my part. I was counting on the fact that any action taken against me would only give credibility to the things I was saying. And they seem to have adopted an attitude early on that they were going to treat accusations that the government itself carried out those bombings as just some sort of fringe conspiracy theory. And the best way to do that was not to do anything violent in relation to me. But, of course, given the sensitivity of the topic, a different reaction might have been possible on their part, I mean. My knowledge of them, the Russian psychology, the Putin regime, led me to believe that they would not take any kind of violent action against me. And in fact, they didn't while I was in the country. It came to just a decision to expel me. How they are likely to react in the future is unpredictable, I think, because they're handicapped by the fact that I'm outside the country. Of course, they do carry out acts of violence, for want of a better way to put it, against people who are outside the country. But it's much more complicated. And my guess is that at this point in historical time, they're not going to want to give the things I'm saying greater credibility by taking some kind of direct action against me. Let's hope I'm right.
This Trump-Putin bromance that occurred during the election, do you have any guess what that's based on? Collusion, end the sanctions, deal, any of that stuff?
No, I think that's all a lot of nonsense. I think that what it's based on is just vintage American dilettantism and stupidity. Every American presidential candidate since Reagan, practically, Reagan was the great exception, also the most effective president in dealing with Russia, has gone into office or has waged his campaign with the idea that because of the charm of his personality, he can bring the Russians around and we can have a working relationship. It's always the same. A president comes into office blaming the problems in U.S.-Russian relations on his predecessor, as Obama did in the case of George Bush. And then over time, he begins to understand that the problems are really the result of Russia's own actions. But that takes usually 4 to 8 years before the reality sinks in. At that point, a new president comes in, announces a reset, and the process just starts all over again. Well, in the case of Trump, he saw that there were bad relations between the U.S. and Russia. He didn't have any background. He was just a businessman. So he began enunciating some really naive and superficial and actually very harmful positions. And he chose as advisors persons who should have not been anywhere near the center of power, because one of them was somebody who had done business with Gazprom, probably the most corrupt corporation in the world, and an entity that spreads its tentacles of corruption to everyone who has anything to do with it. But since he's become president, Trump, partially because he's now in a position where he has to listen to qualified advisors, and he has access to intelligence information, has moderated a lot of the really ridiculous things he said. And I hope that process will continue. As for the idea that there was collusion or anything like that, that's just nonsense. I know the whole country is going crazy over it, but the fact is the Russian intelligence just doesn't work that way. A Russian intelligence operation designed to change the outcome of an election would have been planned years in advance. It would have involved meticulous preparation and timing, and it would also have been conducted in secrecy. It would have been accompanied by something that's called a cover operation, or in Russian it's called operatsiya prikritya, in order to make sure that the core intelligence operation would never be discovered. Now, we recently had a lot of discussion about the meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and a lawyer who had alleged connections to the Russian government. And this is supposed so that the Russian government according to this version, is handling a move to dictate or to influence the election of the American president by email through a music promoter in London. I understand that people in the U.S. believe this, but no one who actually had real knowledge would take such a thing seriously.
Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com. Find the station closest to you. Listen over the Internet. Get to our podcast. In our next segment, we'll look at the road back to dictatorship in Russia. Our guest has been a Russian expert for over 4 decades. That's David Satter. Before we get into some of these just amazing instances of killing their own people under cover that it was, say, Chechen rebels, etc., you say one of the things that we have to understand over here, which is hard to understand, is that we have to learn to believe the unbelievable and the degradation of humans there. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, we are the inheritors of the Western religious and philosophical tradition, which establishes the ultimate worth of the individual, and in particular argues that the individual is an end in himself. In Russia, the individual is raw material for the realization of whatever crazy idea comes into the heads of whoever it is holding power. And once we get that straight, a lot of things that are confusing or were confusing become clear. But the Russians do everything possible to convince us that they're really just like us and to induce us to react to them as we would react to our fellow Americans. And that allows them to mislead us time and time again.
All right, we're going to get into this road to Putin, and again, you mentioned this earlier. We have very little understanding of these events. Start with the 1999 apartment bombings.
Well, there were 4 buildings that were blown up in the middle of the night and killing hundreds of people. Including entire families were wiped out. In some cases, the remains of those people were never found. The explosion was so devastating, and the bombings were used to justify the Second Chechen War, a new invasion of Chechnya, which was carried out with barbaric methods, but it boosted the popularity of the previously unknown head of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, Vladimir Putin, and resulted in him being elected president. Now, a 5th bomb was discovered in the basement of a building in Ryazan, a city southeast of Moscow, and it was deactivated and tested, and it was tested positive for hexagon, which is the explosive that was used in the previous bombings. And a search began in the city for the persons who put the bomb in the basement, and they were caught. But they turned out to be not Chechen terrorists. They turned out to be agents of the FSB. And now the FSB then announced that this was a training exercise, a purely absurd explanation for what had happened. But it was enough to silence people both inside Russia and in the U.S., by the way, because I received documents from the State Department which made clear that the U.S. government was thoroughly informed about what was happening, but chose to remain silent. And as a result of it, we helped facilitate the conditions under which Putin became dictator for life and all the problems that we have now.
The hostage seizing at a theater on Dubrovka, if I pronounce that right, that was in 2002. Dubrovka. Tell us about that one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 2002 the Second Chechen War was beginning to take a very heavy toll, and many people in Russia were losing their enthusiasm for this war, and public opinion polls showed that many persons, in fact a majority, favored a negotiated settlement. Suddenly, Chechen terrorists, an army of Chechen terrorists who had assembled in the center of Moscow, seize a theater and take 1,000 persons hostage. Well, how was it possible in the middle of a war for 40 heavily armed terrorists riding around in armored cars that are in fact controlled by the FSB, that's the Federal Security Service? How was it possible for them to take control of the theater? And then the government refused to negotiate, flooded the theater with lethal gas, killing hundreds of hostages, of course, and then shooting all of the terrorists. The better to assure that they wouldn't reveal any inconvenient details about their collaboration with the security services. But the result was exactly what the authorities probably wanted. The world was horrified by the barbarity of the terrorists and paid relatively little attention to the details that suggested that the authorities were working with them hand in glove, and overlooked the terrible civilian casualties and the refusal to negotiate, and simply drew the conclusion that any negotiated settlement of the Chechen War was out of the question, and in fact those efforts came to an end.
And just so people realize how profound this is, in the first example, 1999 bombings, what the Russians essentially did was kill their own people to distract and increase the popularity ratings of Putin, which were at 2% at the time, as you say. That's pretty cynical. Now, the 2004, the Beslan School gym massacre.
No, Beslan School massacre, I mean, the hostages were herded into the gymnasium, and the Russia, it's basically the same situation. Evidence of cooperation with the in facilitating the takeover, and then an attack on the terrorists, in this case, with heavy weaponry, including flamethrowers, on a gymnasium where there were terrorists, but there were also hundreds of parents and children, hundreds of whom were burned alive, of course. The lives of the hostages were written off the minute the school was seized.
And David,
that was obvious.
David, related to this, Anna Politkovskaya was a journalist who was very aggressive in investigating all this. What happened to her coming out of this?
Well, Anna Politkovskaya was murdered, and the conditions all demonstrate that this was planned by the regime and carried out by the FSB. Everything we know about that assassination, and her fate was shared by others who tried to investigate the regime's involvement in terrorist acts.
In the remaining 40, 50 seconds, when these things happen, Putin always says, we're going to find these killers. Boris Nemtsov, who was killed in the right almost in the Kremlin. Do they ever find these killers?
Oh, they sometimes round up a bunch of people who they claim carried the killing out. They never find the mastermind, and oftentimes the persons that they round up are just chosen at random. They need to throw somebody in prison or to pretend that they're doing something.
You listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll look at the failure of capitalism as Russia becomes a full criminal state and the failure of separation of powers. Next. We're back with David Satter. The book is The Less You Know, The Better You Sleep, Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship Under Yeltsin and Putin. And I guess let's go into, they moved to capitalism, and you talk about how, you know, the prices are freed and 2,500% inflation eats everybody's savings, and then all these corrupt things are done, from credits, bribes, vouchers. Talk about how did capitalism get so diverted into becoming a criminal state, essentially?
Well, this is always possible when capitalism is practiced without the benefit of the rule of law.
Yeah.
The law is what is necessary in order to regulate the competitive nature of capitalism. And this is something that was understood, among others, Adam Smith, who said that the market is equivalent exchange. You know, I give something, and of course I don't get the same thing back, but I get the equivalent thereof under prevailing conditions of supply and demand. But how do you guarantee equivalent exchange? Only with a framework of rules. And so the very nature of the market presupposes the existence of some type of ethical and legal framework. Now, that's what was destroyed in communism. And as a result, when the Soviet Union disappeared and Russia emerged as an independent state, it didn't have the necessary legal, moral, ethical basis for establishing a market economy, and no steps whatever were taken to create it. The result was that the economy was transformed. It went from an economy of collective ownership, based on collective ownership, to an economy based on private ownership. And it was done in a very compressed period of time. But the final product was not democratic, market-based capitalism, but rather a bandit capitalism run by a criminal oligarchy.
I think at one point, just 110 Putin cronies had about 35% of the GDP. Is it around that level? How much he was able to concentrate?
Yeah, those are the best estimates. That's what they control.
Another amazing statistic: between 92 and 98, the GDP of Russia fell 50%. The life expectancy fell 6 years. So in that sense, Putin looks good by turning stuff around, but based on basic oil money, I would assume.
Well, of course. I mean, the Russians, people in the West who idealize Yeltsin, including a lot of past and present government officials who bet on him, they're reluctant to face the fact that he inflicted incredible hardship on the Russian people, and he was hated for a reason. Then, of course, oil prices began to surge, and in addition, the basic institutions of a market's economy were created, and by this I mean privately owned structures. Obviously, it was a market without, it wasn't a true market insofar as it was heavily monopolized, run by criminals, and without the basis of law. But nonetheless, capitalist structures were created, and so when raw material prices, which had been depressed, began to boom, the conditions were created for a massive economic recovery, and Putin was the beneficiary of that.
And in business, Putin would actually just strip folks of power, right? If they wouldn't subjugate totally to him. And Kordovsky's an example. Yukos Oil was like the biggest company then, and he just put the guy in prison, right?
Yeah, Khodorkovsky. Yeah, he had him arrested, and in fact, he had and has the power to do that to anyone, which is one of the reasons why the oligarchs in Russia those who control big money are completely subservient to the regime.
Has Putin, how much money do you think Putin has or stolen, and where is that money?
Well, he's by most accounts, he's stolen billions and billions, and it's in the West. What he plans to do with it is hard to say, but the mentality that has gripped the people who are in charge in Russia is a mentality of literally uncontrolled gluttony. It is just they don't have, by their very nature, they don't have a conception of any reason for which wealth might be used. And so they fall into a cycle of endless accumulation. Nothing is enough. And they've passed on these habits to their entourage, to their hangers-on, to all those who are connected with them. They buy everything. They buy yachts, planes, villas. They buy women. But no matter how much they acquire, they never have enough. I had a friend who sold private jets, or who was involved in the sale of private jets to Russian oligarchs. And in the case when an American buys a private jet, an American corporate executive or successful businessman, he's very concerned about the technical specifications. When a Russian buys a private jet, he wants to make sure that it's just as expensive and gaudy as the jet that his friend bought. Its actual qualities don't interest him much. And that's the mentality that is driving those at the center of Russian power.
Now, you do a great job of explaining how Putin basically eroded the separation of powers almost methodically. You call it vertical power, but obviously in this country we like to have an independent media, independent business, Congress, and courts. Take us through how he basically cut through each one of those.
Well, in fact, it wasn't Putin who took the first step, and maybe the most important step. It was Yeltsin, because in 1993, Yeltsin abolished the parliament, and that set the pattern for everything that was going to happen afterward. By the way, our uninformed American officials fully supported the action of Yeltsin, and this is one of the reasons why we have these problems today. Yeltsin dispersed the parliament, and he did it violently. He did it with the help of provocations. And so the pattern was set very early, and it was set not by Putin, it was set by Yeltsin. The super presidency that was created under Yeltsin basically stripped the legislative branch of government of any ability to control the actions of the people in the executive. And from that point on, it was a question of controlling the press. Well, Putin's first project as president was to take control of the national television networks, which he did through a series of rather complex financial maneuvers in one case, and in the other by arresting the leader of an independent television network and telling him either to hand over the network or go to jail. Once national television was in the hands of the regime, and the next step was to stamp out independent business. And that was undertaken with the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and the sentence he received to a long term in a labor camp. He was accused of tax fraud avoiding taxes and fraud. The details of the charges against him were I would say this. The charges against him could have been brought against any Russian oligarch who made money in the 1990s. So this was a case of selective prosecution. All those who were subservient to Putin and made sure that their wealth was used for the political purposes of the regime where necessary, were allowed to keep their wealth. Khodorkovsky, who had independent political ambitions, he was put in jail, and the message was conveyed to everyone else. So the regime now controlled the parliament, the media. It had subordinated business, and under these conditions, there was really no room for an independent legal system or an impartial prosecutor or police. And so one by one, the levers of power were simply taken over by the regime. Today, no real opposition is possible within the structure of government.
Wow. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC, and WGCH Greenwich. We'll talk about Russia's fate in our final national segment. Back with our final segment, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. That's David Satter. Going to ask you about, what you see Russians' fate as. And you look historically, they've always liked authoritarian leaders to begin with, czars who were fairly corrupt themselves. What do you see as their fate? And is Putin trying to restore some czarist Russia empire type of vision?
I think, well, he talks about that, but I think that's really just a cover. I think what he's really interested in doing is making sure that he and his cronies hold on to power. I think they're realistic enough to know that Russia, which hangs on in the world on the basis of raw material exports, is not in a position to restore the Tsarist Empire or the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. They threaten that, and they will continue to do it because it convinces a lot of people in the outside world that they have to deal with Russia. But I think that the core objective of this regime is just to hold on to power in a situation in which they know that the days may well come and people will wake up to the realities of their thievery and their crimes.
What will it take for that to happen? And is there a chance of a revolution?
I think it is happening in a way already. There's a lot of discontent, and the recent demonstrations and anti-corruption demonstrations in Russia, which focused on Dmitry Medvedev, the prime minister, but it actually target the entire regime because Medvedev's behavior is typical. They mobilized a lot of young people, and they did it in cities all over the country. I think that tendency can only grow as it becomes clear that Putin has no intention ever to surrender power. The corruption gets worse and worse. The lawlessness gets worse and worse. And it's a stultifying environment that's created for people. And those who are the most creative, the most individual, the most able to contribute to their country are the ones who are suffering the most.
I looked this up, and Russia's GDP, at least a year or two ago, was about $2.1 trillion. Italy's was almost 2.1, so they're almost the same. Why do we treat Russia as a superpower?
Well, I mean, Russia has a formidable army, and it has nuclear weapons, and it has the experience of subversion that it inherited from the Soviet Union. And of course, Russia is a huge country. So, and it has vast natural resources. Under these circumstances, the West is often obliged to deal with Russia, although we take it more seriously than it deserves.
Their economy is in bad shape right now. We, on the other hand, are heading towards energy independence. Should we essentially do economic warfare on them? What sanctions would really hurt Russia?
Well, probably banking sanctions, because they, like everybody else, are dependent on the U.S. banking system. The sanctions that have been imposed are reasonably effective in at least in conveying the message that Russia can be made to suffer for its aggressive behavior. It may be necessary if there's no progress in resolving some of the pressing issues concerning Ukraine, that those sanctions will be intensified.
Is there a threat that they would ever use nukes?
Well, I mean, you can't rule out anything in this world, but I think that that is not their orientation. They are not suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
They definitely are happy to threaten to use them and to gain maximum leverage as a result of that threat. And that's something the fact that they're willing to do that very much characterizes them, and is something we should keep in mind when we talk about improving the relationship with Russia, as if improving the relationship independent of their behavior was an end in itself. But they are not suicidal, as I say. Even the highest-ranking members of Putin's entourage have a pronounced taste for luxury, and they want to enjoy it, and they're not going to be able to enjoy it if they get blown up any more than anyone else can. So I think that of course, the real risk is that an internal crisis in Russia would push the regime to take chances in order to rally the population around itself, and a chain of events which would be set in motion that could lead to some type of military confrontation. And although I don't think it would involve intercontinental ballistic missiles, Russia does have a lot of tactical nuclear weapons, which in a European confrontation, for example, in the Baltic republics or in Poland, might be used. But the situation would have to be very, very desperate for them to think in those terms. And I think that it's highly unlikely, and we're not anywhere near a situation like that right now. I think now we're in a situation in which the use of such weapons may well be threatened, but threatening and deploying, those are two different things.
All right, we're down to the last minute. You may have just done the worst case. I wanted to sum up what you think the best and worst cases are, Russia's fate, and if you already did the worst, just do the best.
Best is that the truth will finally be known about the regime's crimes, that some type of truth commission will be established, both outside and inside Russia, to make the Russian people aware of the dangers of the domination by a lawless state, and that there'll be a new constituent assembly to lay the basis for a real democratic system, to replace the one that was abolished in 1918.
Thanks to David Satterman, a very fast hour. He's certainly not on Putin's approved cronies list. His new book is The Less You Know, The Better You Sleep, Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship Under Yeltsin and Putin. And it's clear how little we understand here in the U.S. of the true nature of the regime and what they've done. Thanks to David Satterman. Thanks to our national audience for listening, and we'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.